I don't see other people coming in. And before my computer cuts out again, it's done it twice already, so it's froze up.
Jeez.
And thought I had it fixed, but I guess not. All right, well, welcome everybody. We got a great program tonight. A few business things first. Christmas bird counts are coming up in December, on December 18th for Bremer County, and the 19th of December for Blackhawk County. It's a Saturday and Sunday. If you're interested in participating, and contact Francis Moore so he knows that you're going to do this, and free to come along. It's a good day, come part of the day or all the day. We typically have lunch someplace, and or if you want to do it on your own, report your sightings later, that's fine. There also is going to be one in should be one in Buchanan County. We haven't gotten any of the information on that yet. And also in Hardin County, we haven't received the dates for that yet either. So kind of watch the website, Facebook, that'll go out on that too, and when we know more down the road. So
I'll be going. Hey,
go
Tom,
ahead, Francis.
I'll be going down to Keokuk for that count. If anybody wants to go with me.
Okay, when is that?
The 20th
20th
on
December.
Monday.
It's the Monday. Okay, you can do 3 in a row.
Always the first Monday.
Yep, fantastic. So as long as Francis is talking, he's our finance guy, and he says we've got $10,402 basically in our account right now, and we have $365 in the bird feed fund, which is just getting going. I think the bird feeders are should be up and operational in our 3 areas that we do. So we'll need more money in that account. So if you're free and able to do that, specify, send a check or something for our bird feed fund, and we appreciate your support with that. We had a great birdathon this year. Craig, thank you so much for all your hard work with doing that. It's successful. We were just one shy of 60 giving units. People that gave extra besides their dues. We really appreciate that. And we came up with almost $6,000 this year, as close to what we did in 2016. So it's not too late to contribute. We'll be looking at the projects we're going to do, sending our grant applications in January. We'll be having a board meeting in the next month. So we thank you all for your support for that. The contributors are listed in our newsletter. And let's see. Wednesday morning bird field trips that we've had were successful. Again, thanks to Craig and Chris for arranging those. We've had some good participation. And a total of 90 different species on 7 different outings. That's pretty darn good, I think. And it's just fun to get out, get some fresh air, and see what we've been seeing. Candace had shared some early sightings that she's seen in Wyoming, and also the 45 whooping cranes. I don't think I've ever seen that many in one place anywhere. Do you want to tell us about that real quick, Candace?
Certainly. So I couldn't resist. I was in Wyoming at my parents' for the last week, and I was driving home on the weekend, stopped and stayed the night in Kearney. And my sister had sent me a post she saw on Instagram that was Michael Forsberg's. And those of you who know Michael Forsberg, fabulous photographer and conservationist as well in Nebraska. He's in good company with Mr. Helzer, and you're both a good company. And so it said, like, keep your eye out for whooping cranes. And I'm like, okay, well, I could go wander around my country roads near Kearney, but I thought I'm just going to kind of head east a little bit. So, but between a little bit west of Grand Island, I pulled into a spot where there's normally just one whooping crane that hangs around with the sandhills. And I thought it might be a good chance. There were cars at that particular bridge, so that was a good sign. And when I walked up, the lady said there's a lot of whooping cranes on the sandbar. And I looked and there were 40 some whooping cranes on the sandbar out there. And it was phenomenal. And I will try to get my link posted. There were 2 adults that had flown from the sandbar, so they're not visible in my video, but I have counted and counted as much as I can on my video, and I come up with 43. And it was just astounding. There are about 504 birds in the wild flock, and those are the birds that move through Nebraska. And by my calculations, I saw 9% of that population, which was, again, just surreal. So it was a birding event to remember. So, and when I read Tom's column in our newsletter, the most ever, I thought, well, how apropos that I could share this story with you all. So, at any rate.
And fantastic. We're starting to get some of our winter birds coming through, starting to see a few American tree sparrows. I've seen some rusty blackbirds. Some of the hawk migration has been a little slow in most of the areas where I've been. But if you have a sighting or a comment you want to make, you can go to our chat room and share that. Or if you have a question for any of us and our speaker as we go along, we'll take those questions. So probably after the meeting or after the Chris's presentation. So next month in January, we're off in December other than the Christmas bird counts, and in January we'll start again with 11th, and we're hoping that'll be our last Zoom. We're not sure yet. Hope we can get back into our facility face to face again. But there's an author on Sarah Dykman on bicycling with butterflies. I think you'd enjoy that. On monarch ecology, bike touring basics, and stories from her 10,201 mile adventure. So it should be quite a program too. And boy, we've got a treat tonight. So glad to have Chris Helzer here from Nebraska. Being on Zoom, we can pull people in from far away. I had a chance to, and maybe some of you did, to hear him on the Day of Insects program, that is an annual event at Ryman Gardens in Ames. It was just a fantastic presentation, Chris. So I'm going to turn it over now to Candace, who will do our introduction, and we'll get started with Chris's program.
So again, we're really pleased that Chris has agreed to join us tonight. He is the Director of Science for the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska, where he conducts research and helps evaluate prairie management and restoration. He is dedicated to raising awareness about the value of the prairie ecosystems through his photography, writing, and his presentations. And some of us most recently heard him as well with the Iowa Prairie Network. And again, that captured our attention and made us want to invite him to join us and do this presentation tonight. I became acquainted with Chris and his work when I lived in Nebraska through his blog, The Prairie Ecologist, which again, fabulous photos, really interesting facts, and you learn so much by following his blog. We do have a link to his blog on our website, so check that out. Chris is also the author of 2 books published by the University of Iowa Press. One is titled The Ecology and Management of Prairies in the Central United States, and the second book is Hidden Prairie, Photographing Life in 1 Square Meter. He lives in Aurora, Nebraska. And again, I'm jealous right now of his life in Nebraska. And we're just really pleased to have you with us, Chris. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. So first, I'm going to apologize for my voice, which sounds like it's booming all over the room that I'm in. But I'm at the Niobrara Valley Preserve in north central Nebraska. It's one of our Nature Conservancy sites here. And I'm helping with a bison roundup, which is why I've put bison behind me in the picture. but it means that I'm not at home in my regular space for doing this. And so I'm in a conference room where the light makes me feel like I'm being interrogated and my voice sounds like I'm booming from the sky. So I hope you can understand what I'm saying. I apologize for the sound quality. But tonight, I want to talk about conservation, and I want to talk about storytelling and how we engage the public. But I'm going to start with some nature, and I want to tell some stories and then talk about why stories are important, and then tell one more story at the end. And I want to start with milkweed, because milkweed is something that is capturing the attention of the public right now in a really exciting way, I think. People are on the monarch butterfly train, and it's been a great way, and pollinators in general have been a great way to get people engaged in conservation. And it's brought in new people, and it brought in people in a different way. I think partly because it gives people something they can do, right? Everybody can plant milkweed in their yard and feel like they're contributing, and they are. So in Nebraska, we have 17 species of milkweed. I don't know what Iowa has. I'm guessing it's very similar to that. And milkweed comes in all different shapes and sizes and colors. So there's the common milkweed that I think most people probably envision when they hear the word milkweed. There's showy milkweed for us, which is kind of in the western part of the state, and the two of them actually hybridize. They're very similar. But there's other milkweeds that don't look anything like that, right? Like narrowleaf milkweed or sand milkweed, and 13 other species that we haven't talked about. And milkweed is great because it attracts a lot of pollinators, whether it's bumblebees or flies or butterflies. Here's a Regal Fritillary butterfly on common milkweed. But most people know it because of the monarch butterfly. And the diversity of milkweed species is really important for a lot of things, including monarch butterflies, because monarch butterfly caterpillars will use their larvae will use milkweed of all those species to varying extents, but they can use any of them. And that was important a few years ago here in Nebraska. I don't know if the same thing happened in Iowa, but in 2017, we had monarch butterflies show up way too early. So normally, they show up in May, kind of mid-May maybe, and we're getting the second generation out of Mexico, right? So the butterflies that leave Nebraska, and again, I assume Iowa, in the fall, fly all the way to Mexico. They spend the winter in Mexico, and then those same individuals fly back up into the US, and they lay eggs in the southern part of the United States. And then the generation that hatches out of there, out of the southern US, is the one that we get. Those are the butterflies that we get. So we get the second generation out of Mexico normally. But for some reason in 2017, mostly weather related, I think, we were getting butterflies all the way from Mexico, and they look like this picture, which is why we knew that, because they're very faded. They'd had a long life already. And they showed up in April in Nebraska, and we weren't ready for them. The milkweed plants, especially common milkweed, which is what they like the most, were just barely out of the ground. And then we had a hard freeze that knocked them back again. And so we had a bunch of butterflies that were desperate for food, and they were desperate to lay eggs. And fortunately, we had other species of milkweed, including whorled milkweed. And whorled milkweed saved the day in this case, because monarch butterflies that was the only milkweed species really available that hadn't frozen back. And so we had a lot of eggs and a lot of caterpillars on whorled milkweed that spring, which it's not that they don't ever use it, because they do, but it's usually sort of down the list in terms of priorities, it seems like. But in 2017, the diversity of milkweed species meant that there were at least some species like whorled milkweed that were still available, even in a weird year when the monarchs were here early and there was been a freeze. And as a result, monarch butterflies, were able to reproduce with that first generation and continue growing their population over the summer. So there were more butterflies to go to Mexico again. But the other thing what's fun with milkweed is that there are a lot of other species that are specialists on milkweed, right? That they've figured out in one way or the other how to deal with that toxic latex, that white sticky stuff inside the leaves and stems. And a few examples I'll share with you here. There's a longhorn milkweed beetle. This is it's a milkweed leaf beetle larva. And this is a large milkweed bug. This is, by the way, did you know that large milkweed bugs are migratory? I just learned this a couple of years ago. I didn't know that before. But at least up in our part of the world, a lot of these milkweed bugs are migratory. They fly south and then back up north again the next year. That's crazy to me. Here's some of the nymphs. This is what you normally see on milkweed plants. The adults are much less common or much less visible, but they're still around too. And then there's a small milkweed bug, which is different than the large milkweed bug. Here you can see a small milkweed bug on the left and a nymph of a large milkweed bug on the right, both feeding on the same plant. There's the milkweed stem weevil. And then there's my favorite insect, I think, or at least my favorite name of an insect that feeds on milkweed, which is the unexpected moth. This is a caterpillar that is a specialist feeder on milkweed. It's apparently a very localized species. So it's not common to see it, but when you see it, you see a lot of them. And I photographed this one this spring down in Kansas at the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in the Flint Hills. And I'd never seen this species before. And I saw probably 20 of them that day and photographed several of them. And then because you have a lot of insects on milkweed, not just the specialists that are feeding on the leaves and stems, but also, of course, there's lots of species that are drawn to the flowers. You have a lot of predators that hang out on milkweed because it's a good place to hunt, including this crab spider. And so the diversity of milkweed species is interesting, but it's also really important because it builds redundancy and resilience into a system that supports things like monarch butterflies, even in crazy years, all those other species that specialize on all the pollinators. And in this photo, the arrows aren't pointing to this, but if you see those little tiny insects, there are little thrips on those flowers. There's tiny little invertebrates that like to feed on milkweed too. So it supports this entire community of species. And the diversity means that there's a redundancy so that every year, no matter what's happening, there should always be some milkweed species available to support all those things that it supports. So that's really neat. But the last thing I want to talk about is the pollination process, because I don't know if you know the story about how pollination happens with milkweed. If you don't, it's a story that's worth knowing. So here's what happens. The arrows in this picture are pointing to little slits on the sides of the flowers. Inside those slits is where the pollen is, but it's not granular pollen like you think of in most flowers. Milkweed pollen is stuck together like a couple of little gummy bears, connected by a little thread, makes them look like two saddlebags. And what happens for pollination to occur, insects that are crawling around on those flowers, like this wasp, their leg has to accidentally slip into one of the slits on a flower. And then when its leg ends up in there and it pulls its leg out, often, it will hook those pollinia, those little gummy bears of pollen, and it'll pull them out with it. And this is something that is completely accidental. Insects don't want to do this because sometimes you'll see insects that get stuck in them and they actually either die or they pull their leg off as a result. So it's not something that insects are choosing to do. It's an accidental process that happens a lot of times. And here's what those little pollinia look like on the same moth that we've been watching here. After about a minute or two of crawling around on this swamp milkweed flower, those little tiny yellow things, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sets of them there that you can see. Those are pollinia, okay? And so it slipped its legs into those slits a lot of times and pulled out pollen as a result. And here's another picture. You can see it a little closer. It's actually trying to pull the pollinia off of its foot, and it wasn't successful while I was watching it, at least. So now we're halfway done with pollination, right? The pollen has come out of a flower. That's great. That's one step. But for pollination to happen, it's got to go back in a different flower, right? And the way that happens is that same insect has to get its same leg stuck in a different flower, in the slit of a different flower. And then when it pulls its leg out this time, the pollinia have to be left behind. So it has to scrape those pollinia off and leave them in another flower. This is a process that shouldn't work, right? It's impossible seeming that this would be a strategy that would carry a species into the future. And yet, every fall, there are milkweed seeds flying all over the place. So it obviously works somehow. But it's a really crazy strategy, and it's one of my favorite stories about how pollination works. Okay, I'm going to change gears. I want to talk about flies. And I want to ask you a question because this is my favorite statistic, I think, in all of nature. So there was a paper that came out, I can't remember how long ago, 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. And it was cataloging the number of species of different groups in North America. And flies had the highest number of species among all the groups. So beetles worldwide have the most species, but in North America, flies have the most species. And between published accounts and estimates, because we haven't discovered all the species of flies yet, I want you to guess in your head the number of fly species that are in North America. How many different kinds of flies are there, do you think? Just think about that number for a second, and I'll tell you the actual number. The actual estimate is 61,000 species of flies in North America. That's mind-blowing, right? How many species of flies can you name? Go. Housefly, horsefly, housefly, horsefly, deer fly, yeah, fruit fly, right? So there are 61,000 species of flies, and very few of us know more than a handful, right? That's a crazy number. So some of them look like this, which is kind of what you expect flies to look like. But some of them don't. Some of them look like this picture wing fly that looks like it's wearing a gas mask. There are these little hover flies, these little flower flies that are really important in terms of feeding on pollen on flowers like spiderwort, but also feed on the pollen of grasses. They do some pollination while they're at it. There are some flies that do a lot of pollination and look like bees, like this one. This is another flower fly. There are crazy looking bees like this, which is called a bee fly, which has a rigid proboscis that sticks out from it. And it feeds on nectar. It can hover in front of a flower and stick that proboscis into the flower to get nectar, or it can land on it. And apparently I've seen people talk about the fact that it eats pollen as well as nectar, but I don't know how that happens because somehow it would have to suck that pollen up through that very long tube. And that just seems like a really tough task. But there are people that say it happens. Here are 3 different kinds of flies, all feeding on pussy toes on one kind of flower in the spring. I took all these within about 2 minutes of each other. And I want to highlight one of these right there. This is a tachinid fly. And tachinid flies are really interesting. Here's another picture of one. You saw this same fly earlier on butterfly milkweed. Tachinid flies are a parasitoid. And what that means is if you're not familiar with parasitoids, they lay their eggs on other living creatures. And when those eggs hatch out, their larvae crawl into that living creature and basically eat them from the inside out. It's a terrible way to die. But parasitoids are really important in terms of being able to control populations of other insect species. And so a lot of things that we consider to be pest insects would be much bigger pests, or sometimes are much bigger pests when parasitoids aren't around to do their jobs. There are species like crane flies, which look like giant mosquitoes. If you've ever seen something that you thought was just a mosquito that was too big to be true, it probably was a crane fly. Crane flies, most crane fly species feed on roots of plants. They live underground as larvae. And then as adults, they come out, and many of them don't feed at all as adults. Some of them feed on pollen and nectar, but they're not at all dangerous to people. They don't make you itch. They don't bite you. They just look like big mosquitoes. And I think my favorite fly to photograph and to watch is the robber fly. Right? So here's a robber fly that has just caught a little leafhopper. So that right underneath its eyes, you see this little long black mouth part. That long black mouth part, when it catches an insect, it injects it with venom through that mouth part that paralyzes and eventually liquefies its prey, and then it can just suck the juices out of whatever it caught. It's the same thing that spiders do. It's a pretty common strategy for a lot of insect predators actually too. But so this is pretty neat. And so what they'll do is they'll sit on a perch and they'll wait for something to fly up off of a flower, off of a leaf or something, and they'll intercept it in the air, just like a surface to air missile. They just launch themselves into the air. They knock whatever it is either out of the sky, or they grab it with their big front legs, and then they paralyze it, liquefy it, and eat it. So this one caught a little leafhopper. That's cute. Here's a picture of a similar robber fly species that caught a tiger beetle, which is a pretty impressive predator on its own. And I actually saw this happen. I was on a sand blowout in the sandhills of Nebraska, big old area of bare sand. I was trying to take pictures of tiger beetles, and I was chasing this little blue tiger beetle around because it was gorgeous, looked like a little jewel. And I would get just almost close enough to get a picture, and it would fly up about 6 feet and then land, and I'd have to crawl up again. But about the third or fourth time that happened, it took off into the air, and all of a sudden this robber fly came out of nowhere, knocked it out of the sky, landed on its back with it, wrapped it up in its legs, and then eventually rolled over and held it like this while it paralyzed it. And I was able to crawl close enough to get my tiger beetle picture, but not as I had expected to get it. And that was pretty impressive. But even more impressive was, I think, the same species. I was out with my daughter in the sandhills, and we were walking, and we heard a cicada take off right at our feet and fly. And you can always hear cicadas when they get up and fly, right? They make a very loud sound as they fly. But this one made a sound, but only for a short period of time. And then it stopped. And it stopped quick enough that both of us kind of stopped and looked at each other. And I turned around and walked back to see what had happened. And I finally found this cicada laying on the ground with a robber fly on top of it. That robber fly had knocked it out of the air, even though this cicada is 3 or 4 times its weight, I would think at least. Knocked it out of the air, and then still managed to subdue it, paralyze it, and liquefy it. You can see its mouth part, it kind of inserted in the gap there in the armor of this cicada. So these are really impressive creatures, great predators, and they're a kind of fly. And they got all those things going for them. And then some of them have an additional advantage, which is just completely unfair, which is that they look like bees or something else. So here's one that looks a lot like a bumblebee, but this is a robber fly. And it caught this little beetle, probably on a flower, feeding on a flower. And so I just like to imagine the thought process of this little beetle, right? So it probably was coming into land to feed on a flower. It was scanning its environment, looking for danger, didn't see anything. All it saw was this bumblebee over there. It said, oh, bumblebees, I know bumblebees, they're fine. They never bother me. And that was the last thing that this beetle ever thought in its entire life. Okay. I could give you a 2-hour presentation on flies, but I'm not going to. I want to switch and talk about grasshoppers real quick, because grasshoppers are a group of species that I think are unfairly maligned. People tend to think of them as all the same, but in Nebraska, we have 108 different species of grasshoppers. Actually, I think it's up to 110 now. I'm sure, again, Iowa's probably pretty similar to that. Although you get more species of grasshoppers the further west you go, they like warmer, drier environments more. But Iowa's still got to have a bunch of grasshopper species. And I think when people think about grasshoppers, they think there's green grasshoppers and there's brown grasshoppers. And then I've seen some grasshoppers that are green and brown. And that's kind of the extent of the thought that people give to grasshoppers, which is too bad, because even just on appearances, there are some crazy looking grasshoppers out there, like this one with red antenna and this little ridge on its back. Or this one, which is my favorite, I think, around here. It's the lubber, the plains lubber, which is the size of a mouse. It's a humongous grasshopper. It's gorgeously colored with these kind of pastels, that salmon colored wing there. That's the full size wing. This is a flightless grasshopper. So that salmon colored wing, that doesn't get any bigger than that. So this is a grasshopper that only hops and only jumps and crawls around. And it feeds mostly on wildflowers. So it's a broadleaf plant feeder, which a lot of grasshoppers are. You think grasshopper, you think they eat grass. They don't. I mean, a lot of them do, but a lot of them eat a mixed diet, and some of them specialize, like this one does, only on broadleaf plants. And some are specialists on only 1 or 2 species of plants. So the plains lubber is a big, gorgeous grasshopper. The candy stripe, or the barber pole grasshopper, or the painted grasshopper, all the different names. This is another flightless grasshopper, another really beautiful species. It's a western dry prairie kind of species, not just a green or brown species. Some of them are, and this one is actually surprisingly hard to see. It looks like it's brightly colored, but the patterning is like a zebra, and it actually is really hard to see it in the shadows of a sunny day in the vegetation. Here's another really well camouflaged grasshopper. This is a toothpick grasshopper, which when it sits up against the stems or leaves of other grasses, it's really hard to find. But not as hard to find as this one, which is, so this is white sage or cudweed sagewort. And this is the cudweed grasshopper, which is a specialist feeder on cudweed sagewort. So it almost exclusively feeds on cudweed sagewort or white sage. And the camouflage is just astounding, right? Not only the color is one thing, but the texture. The texture is the same texture as those leaves, except put on a grasshopper. And this is a species that if you're walking through a patch of cudweed sagewort, if you kind of sweep it with your feet, sometimes you'll see these little white things jump out of it. That's the grasshoppers, but it's almost impossible to find them until they jump, because when they're just sitting on the leaf feeding on it, they're really, really well hidden. But you also have to give some credit to these grasshoppers. So this is a grasshopper. This is a group of grasshoppers that likes to live on bare soil, and they're really well camouflaged for bare soil. They're called band wing grasshoppers. And they're called band wing grasshoppers because many of them, when they fly, they make kind of a clacking sound as they fly, which helps distract predators. But they also display this really beautiful wing as they fly. It looks like a butterfly wing a lot of times. So multicolored, sometimes an orangish color or yellow, usually with a black stripe, which is where they get the name bandwing grasshoppers. So they're really well camouflaged until they fly, and then they try to startle the predator enough that they can land somewhere and instantly be camouflaged and hidden again when they land. And I'm not going to talk about grasshoppers in terms of their communication strategies, which is fascinating. I'm not going to talk about the reproductive strategies, which are fascinating. I'm just going to talk about this because I have to get on to other stories. But I encourage you to look up grasshoppers because there's a lot to learn about them. And then there's other species that are in the same group, like tree crickets and other crickets, which are really similar in many ways, but different in others. There's katydids, which again are similar, but also very different. One of the things about katydids, well, with both crickets and katydids, the difference between a grasshopper and a cricket or katydid is the antenna length. So look at how short those antennae are in a grasshopper. That's a grasshopper. But if the antennae are as long as the body or longer, then it's either a cricket or a katydid. It's an easy way to tell them apart. And the other thing, if you look really close at a katydid, they don't have ears on their head. Grasshoppers don't either. Grasshoppers hear out the side of their body, little holes on their side of their body, but katydids hear from their elbows. So that little hole right there on its elbow, just on the front legs, that's the hole that a katydid listens through. And then one of the things about grasshoppers, crickets, and katydids is that they're an incredibly important food source for birds, but also for lots of other things, including small mammals and others, spiders, all kinds of predators. But if you want to raise birds to adulthood, grasshoppers and caterpillars are two really, really important groups. And they're super abundant. They're easy to catch. They're full of a lot of protein. So you should be happy about grasshoppers if you're a fan of birds. And of those 108 species in Nebraska, only a handful are considered to be pests. And even those, they're really only pests in certain situations. And they're native species. So these are species that have just adapted really well to what humans have provided, kind of like white-tailed deer. And so if you give a grasshopper species that likes grass, a whole field of nothing but grass, they're going to eat it. And that becomes a problem for cornfields. It also becomes a problem cyclically in some pasture areas of the state. But these are just native species doing their job really, really well. And again, most species don't have anything like that kind of potential to become abundant and cause economic issues. And I'm going to circle back now and tie this back into flies by saying that if you remember the bee fly we talked about earlier with its long, stiff proboscis, if you're not a fan of grasshoppers or you don't want to have too many grasshoppers, bee fly should be one of your favorite insects, because what the bee fly does is as an adult, it's a pollinator. But when it lays its eggs, it flies around and it looks for grasshoppers that are laying its eggs on the ground. And what grasshoppers do is they stick their rear end in the ground and then they lay eggs into a little tunnel into the ground. The bee fly will hover right above that grasshopper. It'll flick its own eggs onto the ground right next to where that grasshopper is. And when the eggs hatch, the larvae crawl down into the tunnel where all the grasshopper eggs are, and they eat them. So they just basically eat all the eggs that grasshopper spent all that time laying. So the bee fly, not only is it a pollinator, but it also helps control insect population or grasshopper populations. Okay, now those are a bunch of stories that I like. I have lots of more. But the reason I'm talking about this today is that I want to sort of recruit your help. And most of you are probably doing some of this anyway. But it's really important that we remember that we as a group here all care about nature and conservation, right? It's a big part of our lives. We appreciate it. It makes us happy. We feel strongly about it. But most of the public isn't seeing things the same way. They have other priorities, right? And it's not that they're bad people, and it's not that they're even bad priorities, but we need to make sure that nature and conservation is one of those priorities. And if we don't do that, if conservation isn't important enough to the public, nothing we do matters. Nothing I do in my job is going to matter, because nature is going to continue to degrade over time, because nobody cares. Nobody's going to vote for policies that help with conservation. Nobody's going to support funding. Nobody's going to donate money to conservation organizations. And everything we're doing here is going to be for nothing. So we have to raise the profile of conservation among the public. We have to. There's just no other way around it. And how do we do that? I think sometimes what we bend ourselves toward right away is this idea of giving people facts. We lecture people about why nature is important, right? You need to save nature because it does all these things for us. And that's true, it does, right? All of these things on this list are important, but that's not how you start a conversation with somebody if you really want them to pay attention, right? You don't meet a new friend and start by spouting facts about something you care about. You start by sharing stories, and you find common ground, and you build empathy with each other, and you build a relationship, and then you can start to share, facts and try to convince them to do something if you feel like doing that. But you don't start with that, or they just walk away. So what I'm hoping to convince you of tonight is it's really important for all of us to share the passion that we have, the enthusiasm we have about conservation and nature with other people, because it's contagious. And it can be hard because if you're like me, I like giving presentations like this, but the idea of going to a party and having small talk with people just scares me to my boots. It's not what I want to do. I'm an introverted person in general. And so sharing my stories is hard in some contexts, but I try to find other contexts that I'm comfortable with. And when you do share your story, like all those things I talked about earlier with grasshoppers and flies and milkweed, those are great stories. But what makes them even better is that they're stories that you think are important, and they're stories that you care about and that you are telling your friends about with enthusiasm and passion, right? And the more personal you can make those stories, rather than talking about, hey, did you know milkweed supports, 18 different species of insects? You can say something like, hey, I was out and I saw 6 different kinds of insects today, all using the same kind of milkweed. That was really cool. And here's why I think that was fun. Then it becomes a story about you, and that's going to really resonate with people much better. Because people, we tell stories to each other to connect, right? So tell your own stories when you do this. Things that you think are everyday occurrences. So not 45 whooping cranes, but hey, I saw some tree sparrows today. That was really cool. But I see tree sparrows every day or every year at this time. Nobody really cares about that. That's not a story I need to tell. No, you should tell that story, because if it was interesting to you, if it was something you care about, other people will care about it because you care about it, right? If they like you, they'll like your stories. And you can do this in person. You can do this at the bowling alley. You can do this on Facebook. You can do this in any way that you connect with people. You can connect with your stories and share stories with other people. And you don't have to be an expert, right? People don't care how much you know, they care what you care about. So if you have passion for something, you can say, hey, I found the coolest insect today. I have no idea what it is, but look at this insect that I found today. That's enough. That's more than enough to catch people's interest and get them to think about nature for 1 or 2 seconds, right? And they'll think about it because it was something you brought up. In case you're wondering, this is a mantid fly. So it's a wasp mimic mantid fly, which is not a wasp or a mantid or a fly. It's actually related to antlions of all things. But it's a really interesting insect. It's a predator. It's not related to mantises, but it has the same kind of front feet that a praying mantis has. Anyway, that's a mantid fly, but that's not important. The important thing is, look at this crazy insect. This is amazing. Okay. And that leads me to my final thing I want to talk about tonight, which is a project I did back in 2018, where I went out in a prairie right across town from where I live. It takes me just a few minutes to drive over there, or 15 minutes to walk over there. It's called Lincoln Creek Prairie. And I went out in this little tiny skinny patch of prairie, and I put 4 yellow flags in the ground in January. And I told myself, I'm going to visit this little square of prairie as many times as I can over the next year. And I want to photograph as many things as I can within 1 square meter of prairie as a way to help show people and highlight the diversity and beauty of prairies. It was kind of just a side project for me. It was something to do with my blog, The Prairie Ecologist, as a way to tell stories in a different way for that audience. And so I did that. Over the next year, I visited that. Here's me at that plot in August. I went back, I think, 46 different times, and I photographed a total of 113 species of plants and animals. And that might sound impressive to you, it might not sound impressive to you, I don't know. It's impressive to me because this is not how many species I saw, this is how many species I actually got a decent photograph of. So there were lots of other things. Hang on. Conference room likes to turn off lights if I don't move around. So these are the species that I actually got really good photos of. That included 15 different species of plants. That included 22 different kinds of flies, which that sounds impressive until you compare that against 61,000 species of flies, right? But the flies were the most abundant group of animals in my square meter, which is not shocking now that you know that they're the most abundant group of insects in the country. Found 18 different kinds of beetles. I photographed 14 different species of bees, and then 44 other groups or other species of animals. That includes a couple different praying mantises, lots of spiders, wasps, ants, all kinds of other things. And that's fine. The inventory part was kind of the least interesting, actually. The more important thing to me was capturing stories of things that were living, or that at least I found within that square meter. So here's an example. A butterfly milkweed was a plant that was growing in that plot. I was excited to know that when I picked out that square meter, I saw that there was butterfly milkweed, and I thought, okay, this is going to be great because butterfly milkweed attracts a lot of insects. It'll be a great thing to photograph them on. Well, this little bug right here, this leaf bug, is the only species of insect I photographed on butterfly milkweed in the entire year. Nothing ever came to that plant. I don't know why, because I would walk past other butterfly milkweed plants on the way in, and they were loaded with insects. And then I get to my plot and I look at my plant and there was nothing on it, which was crazy. And as a result, it only produced 1 pod of seeds. So it didn't make very many seeds because it didn't get pollinated very much. And I spent a lot of time making sure I didn't miss the opportunity to photograph those seeds. But that was an interesting story that occurred with butterfly milkweed. Stiff sunflower was another perennial sunflower, is another plant that I found in my plot. And I was excited about that too, but I didn't end up getting any pollinator photos of on stiff sunflower because this little leaf beetle showed up and basically just decimated every sunflower that bloomed in that plot. So that's an interesting story. It wasn't the story I thought I was going to tell, but it was a fun story to watch these little leaf beetles tear up these sunflowers. And fortunately, I have 2 different species of sunflowers in my plot. So I had some redundancy and some resilience built in just within my square meter. And the other one was Maximilian sunflower, and it was loaded with pollinators. So here's 3 different insects on 1 flower. There's a soldier beetle there and a couple of bees. And I got lots and lots of pollinator photos off of Maximilian sunflower, which is great. A couple other things I saw. This is a Durbid plant hopper, which is an amazing little insect that sucks the juices out of plants. I didn't know that at the time. When I saw this, and see what you think, I thought it was dead. I thought this is an exoskeleton, that whatever was living in it is no longer living in it. It looks translucent to me. And so I started photographing it thinking it was a translucent, shell of an insect. And then it started to walk around, and that really freaked me out. I didn't expect that at all. Here's a different picture of it. This is actually a different day. I don't know if it's the same exact one, but it's definitely same species. Look at the iridescence on the wings, the reds and the blues. It's a really fascinating looking insect. I'd never heard of it before. The other thing that was fun is I got to watch things happen. I got to sit there and stare at the same area long enough that I saw stories play out in front of me. So I saw this lynx spider sitting on this stem, and nearby I saw this little fly with a white abdomen, which I thought was pretty neat, tiny, tiny little fly. And about a minute later, I saw the spider catch the fly. And I saw that several times during my time. I would be sitting there and I'd watch a predator catch prey or some other kind of interaction happen. It was really fun to do that. And I'm going to end with this because I think the thing that was inspiring to me about this project, and these are all pictures that were from that square meter, was that it taught me a new way to look at prairies. And I'm a photographer that looks at close things anyway, right? But I usually do that while I'm walking around. I walk around, I look for new opportunities, new species to take a picture of, I follow the light. And I was worried that sitting in one place and spending so much time in one spot, I was going to get frustrated because I wasn't out at my regular other places and wandering around widely. And instead, what happened was I got frustrated when I was other places, wondering what was happening in my square meter, which is not at all what I expected to happen. And I'm going to end with this photo here because this is a photo that I think is emblematic of the whole project, which is that I was out in May looking at my plot, nothing was blooming. I was trying to figure out if this project was going to mean anything or if I was going to even finish it up or not. And I was just looking and looking and looking for anything to take a photo of. And I liked the way the light was coming through this sunflower leaf. And I thought, okay, I'll take a picture of the veins in this leaf. That's really neat the way that's happening. And as I settled down with my tripod and started looking at that, I noticed that there were ants running up and down the sunflower stem. And every once in a while, one would come out on the leaf and then go back to the stem again. And I knew what was happening because I've learned this through photography other places, that sunflowers create extra floral nectar. So that's a sweet substance outside the flower, and they produce it, and then it attracts ants because they like sweet things. And what the sunflowers are basically doing is they're buying protection. They're attracting a major predator to hang out on them, and they're feeding them, they're bribing them with this sweet substance, and it helps protect them from herbivores. And I thought, well, that would be kind of a neat story. If I sit here long enough, maybe I'll have an ant that'll come into the frame of my picture. I'll just, keep focusing on this same part of the leaf until an ant comes in. And it took about 10 minutes for that to happen, but it happened. And that was sort of the beginning, I think, of my journey of looking differently at prairies and becoming much more patient and much more willing to stop walking and just sit and pay attention and look at the stories that unfolded in front of me. Okay, so if you sum up the project, my square meter project, one way to do that would be you could have a headline that says, hey, scientists catalogs 113 species in a single square meter. That's pretty interesting, but that's a fact, right? And if you remember earlier what I said about leading with facts, this is not what I would lead with. I think what makes this project resonate with people, and it has in a really surprising way to me, what makes it resonate is the stories that I was able to tell, right? That it's my personal feelings, my emotions, my experiences, sharing those with other people from a very personal perspective is what draws people to this project. And it's why people have started their own square meter projects all over the place, which I find amazing. And I'm really grateful for that. And so some of the lessons I learned from this are to, have lots of photos and stories that are from my perspective. It's a story that was very accessible because anybody could do this in their backyard, right? You could just pick a little part of your garden. It doesn't have to be a square meter, just pick a little area and watch it over and over and over and see what you can find just in one little plot and be inspired. But mostly it was my personal story, really. But I'm not going to take too much credit for this because I had none of this at the beginning when I thought about this. It was just like, there's a new idea, maybe I'll try this and see what happens. But as a result of this project, it turned into a book called Hidden Prairie. And then most recently, this is really exciting for me, it's turned into a museum exhibit. So at the University of Nebraska, the State Museum in Lincoln, Morrill Hall, which if you've ever been to Lincoln and gone to that museum, you might know it as Elephant Hall because it's got a bunch of mammoths in it that are well known. We have a 6-month exhibit on this project, on this square meter project. And it's been up just for a few weeks now, but people have the opportunity now to come in and look at the pictures of all the things I found in the plot. They can read about prairies in general. They can read about the project. And my favorite part of the whole thing is that we worked on constructing literal square meters of prairie. So we went out and we picked plants at all different seasons. We made a spring, a summer, a fall, and a winter prairie in a square meter plot by taking plants and then preserving them. And the guy at the museum that did this is just a wizard. He spent a bunch of time experimenting, trying to find different ways. Some of this is natural color, some of it's painted. He used glycerin to, I think it's glycerin to basically you put the plants in it and it replaces the water with fats that keep them supple and keeps them from shriveling up. And then he would dry the flowers and then glue them on and then paint them to get the colors right. It's amazing. He did a fantastic job with it. And then we populated it with little insects. So now people can come to this museum exhibit and they can stare at a square meter of prairie, just like I did, except they're in a sanitized environment, and they can look for insects. And the longer they look, the more they find. I'm really excited about the opportunity to see kids doing this, to see families doing this together. They're going to have school groups coming through and doing this. It turned out way beyond my expectations. So if you get a chance to go to Lincoln between now and May, stop by the Memorial Hall and check out the exhibit. So that's what I'm going to stop with. My challenge for everybody here is think about the people that you interact with in any format, and what you are interested in and how you can share your enthusiasm about conservation and nature with the people that you interact with, because it really does matter. If we don't do it, all the work that all of us care about is just going to be worth nothing. So I'll stop there and we can chat about whatever you'd like to talk about.
Wow, that was terrific, Chris. I have your book on my desk at work, actually,
Great.
The Hidden Prairie, and it is fantastic. I'll lead off with a quick question. Do you envision that your exhibit will travel after its time at Lincoln? Because I think that would be something, perhaps, because we've got the Tallgrass Prairie Center here affiliated with the University of Northern Iowa, that they might be really interested in.
Yeah, I hope it will. We're actually going to be talking about that later this month. We've already been contacted by somebody in Houston that wants it to travel to Houston, and they're willing to help fundraise for that. Unfortunately, what won't travel well is those prairie plots. They're too fragile to. I mean, they were worried about getting them up the elevator and into the exhibit, let alone trying to ship them somewhere. But everything else, a lot of that can travel, and we might make new exhibits that'll travel and tell the same story in different ways. So yeah, the answer is I hope so. I don't know where it'll travel, but I would love it to do that, just to keep telling the story over and over.
Terrific, thank you. So what questions do you have for Chris? Go ahead and unmute yourself or put your questions in the chat.
I have a question, Chris.
Yeah, Tom.
I have a yard that I enjoy watching the same thing, watching the insects.
Poor Tom.
Technical difficulties.
All right, we'll circle back to Tom. Who else has questions? Tom will have to put his in the chat. Well, let me say this while you're thinking about it. I am not an entomologist. So I talk a lot about insects, but it's just because I'm so enthusiastic about insects. I really am not an expert. What I've done is I take a lot of pictures of insects and then I try to figure out what they are. And I do that mostly by submitting them to a place like Bug Guide, where people will answer my questions for me, or I know enough people that know insects that I can send them an email with a picture and say, please help me, tell me what this is. Because then once you know what it is, you can look up the stories. And I've never once found an insect that has a story that's not fascinating. They're amazing creatures. But I also get myself in trouble because I photograph them and I talk about them enough that everybody just assumes that I know all the insects. And I don't know very many insects at all. I sometimes remember the ones that I photographed. And if I don't remember it, I can look up a photo and remember what it is. So please don't send me photos of insects and expect me to identify. If you want to send me a photo of an insect, I'll help you try to find somebody if I can, as long as I don't get snowballed with them. But yeah, I just wanted to put that out there. I'm not an insect expert. I just want that to be known. All right, Tom, are you back? You want to try again? We lost you. And now he's muted.
Yes.
I've got a question, just a technical question.
Yeah.
What was that, a macro lens you're using on a tripod?
Right. Yeah, it's a 105 millimeter macro lens on Nikon tripod or Nikon camera.
Mhm.
And yeah, I use a tripod as much as I can for insect photos. It's hard because of course the insects are moving and it's hard to move a tripod. But what I found is that when I do take it off the tripod, I have to use a faster shutter speed, which means you get less depth of field, and it just
Yeah,
if I have to do it, I will. But a tripod and a macro lens is a pretty dangerous combination for me. I can stay busy all day with that.
right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I'm back.
Hey, Tom.
I guess it muted me. I didn't know it. Well, it shut off. Okay. So in my backyard, I like looking at the insects and things too. And most of my neighbors are basically a desert, you know, just lawns and not much. So I have some native prairie and little strips here and there. So it's really interesting what shows up. But I get wondering, like this year, like a hickory hair streak and a Gorgon checker spot. And we're talking about urban.
Yeah.
You know, it's just a bunch of houses. People know, you know, basically where I live. And I'm thinking, you know, it's hard enough to find those out where you're looking for them where they should be. Why are they here in my little house, my little plot, and all these things around me are basically like a desert? Do you have any ideas?
Well, I mean, I don't have an explanation for those particular species other than, you know, a lot of those have host plants. And so if you have a host plant, and these are pretty mobile species, I mean, the Gorgon checker spot is a pretty mobile species, right? So if you have the larval host plant for it, which I don't remember what that is for that particular species, but there's a good chance that a butterfly will come through. So it's especially important for migratory species. So we think about monarchs as migratory, right? But I said the large milkweed bug is migratory. We have migratory dragonflies. We've got all kinds of migratory species. We have bees and butterflies that if they're not migratory, they're very mobile. And backyard habitat is incredibly important for those species. And some of those are rare species, but even if the ones that aren't rare, just having our urban spaces be a support system for those communities of insects is incredibly valuable. And it's not unlike feeding birds, because it brings them to your house in a way that you can actually see them. But there's probably a much more conservation benefit even than that with insects and backyard habitat. You know, we're supporting their entire life if we're doing it right. And whether it's migratory butterflies or just pollinators in general or whatever, just the simple idea of putting a few native species in your backyard, being careful about pesticide use, you know, saving some areas where you don't rake all the leaves off your garden and make, like you said, make it into a desert. It's a way that everybody can help. Anybody who has a yard can help with conservation, which is a story we really need to tell a lot more, right? And I'm not answering your question very well. I'm dancing around it. But the last thing I wanted to say on that topic was that, and I'm not answering your question because I don't know the answer. That's the quick answer. But the thing that I think that I love so much about backyard prairies is that it gets people familiar with prairie plants. And that's incredibly important because one of the problems with prairies in terms of selling them to the public is they don't look like anything people care about, right? It's just a bunch of grass. It's just a flat area with a bunch of grass. Who cares? But if somebody can go out to a prairie for their first visit, and when they first walk in, they see something that they recognize and something they have some kind of an affection for, that flips everything. And all of a sudden they've got a connection their first time in, and you don't have to convince them from there on, right? And so if you have somebody who has a black-eyed Susan in their yard, even if they don't even know that that's a prairie plant or a native plant, they know black-eyed Susan, or at least by sight. If they walk out into a prairie and they see black-eyed Susan, it's like, oh, I know that plant. That plant lives in prairies. And then you're off and running, right? And so I think that's even more important than the habitat quality that we get from backyard prairies, which is also very important. But just normalizing a lot of those species for the public, it matters tremendously. Putting them in landscaping in public areas, you know, backyards that people walk past. If you're willing to put up a sign saying, hey, this is a black-eyed Susan, I think that helps. So thank you for doing what you're doing. I don't know the answer to your question, but I managed to talk about it for about 5 minutes.
Yeah. I like how I got around it. It's a great answer. I think what I'm thinking about is like, how do they how do they know to just stop even for a few minutes? They
Man,
must be more mobile than I would think of, not just butterflies, but you know, any
no, they
kind
are
of.
mobile. And I mean, so I'll give you a couple of quick examples of cool things like that. There's a bee that specializes on pitcher sage or blue sage. You know, pitcher sage, it's a tall blue flowered plant. That's the only thing that it feeds on. So the only thing it nectars on is and gets pollen from is the pitcher sage plant. And I've seen that bee show up in restored prairies in the middle of corn country, you know, miles and miles and miles from the next pitcher sage population. And somehow that bee found that prairie restoration within a few years. You know, I've seen them like 3 or 4 years old, these restorations, and they've got that bee has already shown up. So it happens, right? And it's got to be some kind of olfactory, it's using smell or, you know, that kind of sense somehow to find it. So I don't know how it happens, but it does happen. And then the other example is in the same kind of thing. In a restored prairie, there are species that feed on the seeds of Canada milkvetch. And you know that they're there because you can see the little exit holes in the pods of Canada milkvetch. And you'll find those exit holes within, again, a couple of years of planting a new restoration in the middle of nowhere. And those insects will come and find that plant and build that connection again, which to me builds a lot of optimism about the value of restoration, right? We have the opportunity to build out the size of prairies. And if we do that, a lot of those connections that make prairies function can reestablish themselves. Not everything is going to fix itself, but there's a lot that fixes itself without us having to do a whole lot of work other than just sort of set the stage.
Yeah, you build it, they'll come.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Chris, I have a question.
Please.
I'm reading a little bit about your job description. Are you dealing mostly with professionals in their land management function, or are you dealing more with just general citizens in your line of work?
It's both. I mean, I do a lot of presentations like this for you know, people in the public. I also do a lot of presentations like this for biologists that are professional. I think so. We will host field days that we open up to the public on our sites that we manage and try to, you know, just show people what we've been working on, what we're learning, get them excited about prairies. But I will say one of the audiences that I have found to be the most valuable for us to work with is private lands biologists or biologists that work with people on habitat projects, right? So I can work with landowners, but I can maybe talk to what 50 or 100 landowners a year if I'm doing really well. And those 50 or 100 landowners can you know, learn something from what we're doing, and that'll be helpful to them. But if I talk to 50 or 100 biologists who each then talk to 50 or 100 landowners through the year, then all of a sudden I'm magnifying my message much more broadly. So we do talk to the public, but I also really try to prioritize those biologists and try to give them the stories, the information, the guidance that they can then translate out to a lot of other projects and sort of have a bigger influence, hopefully, on you know, kind of shaping the way people are learning from what we and other people are learning in terms of restoration and management. So the answer is yes. I do talk to private landowners and just, you know, public citizens, people that live in towns. But in terms of restoration and management expertise, we try to focus a lot of that also at these other biologists that can take the message out.
Okay, if you were trying to bring it down to a really small level and talk to people about their yards and trying to preserve the habitat in their yards and not apply all kinds of chemicals to their lawns and keep their gardens intact through the winter and that sort of thing, so they're not killing off all of the insects. How would you approach them so that it doesn't feel like you're attacking what they're doing and going against what seems to be the norm of what all the neighbors are doing?
Yeah, it's an excellent and very important question. I mean, there's a lot of ways to do it, and it depends on your relationship with that person, right? But I would say, following my own advice that I just said in this presentation, the way I would probably try to start that conversation would be to talk about my own yard and all the fun things that I'm seeing in my yard. You know, tell the stories about, hey, I saw a gorgone checker spot in my yard, which I don't even know why it's there, right? It shouldn't be there. It's a butterfly that I see out in these bigger natural areas, and it showed up in my yard. That was really neat. And here's why I like it. And you know, I saw a whole bunch of bees on my flowers this year. Did you know that there's, you know, 2,500 kinds of bees, or 5,000 kinds of bees in North America? And, you know, I've seen 30 or 40 different ones just in my own backyard. And it's that passion, it's those stories that I think are going to start that conversation, because they'll say, oh boy, I don't know that I've seen those in my yard. And then you can start talking about, well, yeah, and you know, these bees show up on this kind of plant, and I see very different bees or insects on this kind of plant. And if you look really closely, then you see the little crab spiders that are not going to hurt you, but they'll you know, wait for those bees. That's how I think I would try to approach it with most people. If you get them interested at least a little bit in that, then you can start expanding, and you can start talking about the value of pollinators, you know, which people are into, and you can say, hey, you could do a lot of good for pollinators just in your own backyard. It'll actually have an influence on pollinator communities more broadly. But I don't think I would start with that. I really would start with why you think it's important in your, not why you think it's important, why you like having that kind of habitat in your yard. That's the way I would try to start. I'm not saying it's going to work. But that's what
I have a question too, Chris.
Yeah.
There's a lot of roadside land in the United States, by interstates, secondary highways, roads everywhere. And it seems like I travel in a lot of states, and there's so much mowing for just so many feet on each side of the road, and the huge middle parkades. What, isn't there some kind of way we could communicate to our states? It's going to be better to plant more natural things that would be not have to be mowed and be there for pollinators and other wildlife.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. That is really important habitat, and it's connecting habitat, right? It creates
Yes.
corridors and connections between other patches, which is really important.
How do we do that?
There's not a simple answer to that, of course. But I will say I've had really good conversations with the roads department in Nebraska about this. And what I've heard from them is they're trying. Like in Nebraska, they have schedules that are set for how often roadsides on state highways are supposed to be mowed. And it's like once every 4 years, a particular part of a road is supposed to be mowed once every 4 years. But what happens is we have a drought, and the governor will say, oh, it's a drought. We're going to release, you know, these roadsides for haying, and everybody can go hay them if you want to.
I see.
It's which takes it out of the hands of the roads department. And there's other things like that happen. So I think the roads departments in general have come a long ways in terms of what they're trying to do, but they're not getting support from other people in the government or from, and there's not enough people who are telling the governor and politicians that, hey, we really do care about these schedules that we have set up for mowing, and here's why we care. So that's part of the answer. Another part of the answer is that some of that mowing is done from a safety standpoint. They have research on, you know, we have to mow these shoulders because that helps prevent fires, which can affect neighboring landowners. We have to mow these shoulders because that makes it easier to see an animal coming up before it hits the road, gives people a few more milliseconds to brake before the animal comes out. So some of the mowing right on the immediate shoulders, there's good reasons for them, for that, right? But what you're talking about is those bottoms and the next slope going up, right? Those are the areas that really should be mowed on a much less frequent schedule. But I also really feel for those roads departments and the people trying to maintain them, because I mean, those are places that are full of invasive species, and the invasive spread. Now, some of it they spread by mowing, of course, but it's difficult to maintain those. And the idea that you are going to maintain miles and miles and miles by spot spraying individual plants with somebody walking with a backpack sprayer, it's hard to justify that with the budgets that they're working with, right? So it's really easy for them to say, we've just got to go blast this with herbicide because we don't have time, right? And if we don't, everybody complains about musk thistles or Canada thistle or whatever it is on our roadsides. So they're in a tough spot. So part of my answer is we need to have empathy for the people who are trying to do good things. But the other part of the answer is it's important enough that we should keep pushing, right? But I think it's important to recognize who's making this not work as well as it is. And it's not necessarily the people in the roads departments that are at fault. So I don't know if I'm not helping because I don't know what the answer is, but that's some context around the issue at least.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Chris,
Yeah.
something that
a phenomenon I think we've noticed in our area. I don't know how regional it is, but certainly in our area, we've noticed a decline over the last 10 years, a decline in snails.
Oh, really?
on
Land snails
our
or aquatic snails?
land snails.
Huh.
And in our gardens too, but just have you noticed anything like that in your region? Yeah, that's really important in terms of the calcium that's available for the birds. They eat those snails for nesting purposes.
You know, I would say the prairies that I am familiar with in my part of Nebraska, we don't really see land snails at all.
Yeah.
So either they've declined to the point where they're just gone, but if so, they've been gone since I started working here.
Okay.
We definitely have a lot of aquatic snails, but we don't have very many land snails. So I haven't seen this phenomenon in person, but that's just because it's not part of what I am familiar with. But I would say I've read and heard some things recently about the impacts of fire on snails. Snails are really vulnerable to fire. And so and so are many other insects and invertebrates, right? Not just snails, which are mollusks, but part of the answer could be that in our prairies, especially, we need to be really careful when we're burning, not to burn the whole thing, right? Especially if it's an isolated patch of prairie. If you burn an entire prairie that's isolated from other prairie patches, anything that's vulnerable to fire at that time of year is going to die and potentially be eradicated from that site and not have a way to come back in, right? Despite some of the things Tom was saying about the mobility of these species, which is true, there are things like snails, which are much less mobile, right? So I'm not saying that fire has driven snails out of prairies at all. I don't know that at all.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things that I worry a lot about, because it's not just snails, it's a lot of other insects that, you know, if you burn in the early spring, everything that overwinters in the stems of plants is really vulnerable. If you burn in the late spring, there are a lot of things that are active in the late spring that are vulnerable. If you burn in the summer, there are things, I mean, no matter when you burn, there's a lot of potential that you're gonna have an impact on species. That shouldn't keep us from burning, but it should make us conscious and thoughtful about how we burn and making sure that we leave refuges that are unburned. So anyway, that's a hypothesis that I have, but it's based on nothing but conjecture.
Okay.
But I'm glad you're thinking about snails, because very few people care about snails. And so keep thinking about them and tell them stories about snails. It's important. What else have you got for me?
Any other questions from people? Well, I guess not. What a fantastic program, Chris. We're so blessed to have you join us.
Oh, you're welcome.
And good luck, good fortune in your work over there in Nebraska. You know, back to what Linda was saying, we do have the Iowa Living Roadway Trust Fund here that helps with the roadside management. And it's my understanding that when they dig out a ditch to deepen it or take the dirt out or whatever, they need to put it back with native vegetation. And so that helps. And you're right with the corridors for birds and it's amazing the number of insects, like you were mentioning, the caterpillars and things that birds use to successfully nest. And we, you know, that's been our initiative here too, is to encourage backyard habitats, urban habitats, pollinators. It benefits the whole ecosystem. So, you know, spread the word and spread your stories. And by the way, if you have a story you want to write, so send it to our newsletter. It'd be good to hear from well other people who enjoy your stories.
This is why you have your job, Tom. Good job. That was really well.
Well, thanks.
You're here.
Thanks to the Nature Conservancy too. I appreciate you guys. A lot of us belong to Nature Conservancy and others. So with that, we'll hope to see you on Christmas bird counts. Maybe.
Hey, Tom.
We'll say thank you, Chris.
Hey, thanks, everybody. It was really nice.
Yeah.
For birds.
Thank you again. Yo.
Anything you can find.
Yeah, feel free to
Back
get a hold of me
again.
if you have
Froze
questions
up.
or anything. Candace, you're welcome to share my email address with people if they want to contact me. Please do.
Okay, perfect. Thank you again so much. And thanks everybody for joining us tonight. And as Tom was saying, we look forward to having people participate with us with our Christmas bird counts. Information's getting posted on our website, and it's included in our November newsletter. And yes, and I wanted to report too, Linda Fitzgerald had a really good sighting that she posted in the chat, and I saw it on the Iowa Rare Bird list actually too. She had a black crowned heron at here in Blackhawk County the other day. So when she was kayaking, so that was a cool sighting as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, and you know, as Chris said, when you share your stories and your enthusiasm, it does encourage others. I work at a library at our local community college, and my staff care more about nature and birds because of the stories that I share with them. And you can tell, I can tell that they've warmed up to it. So, and we have ornithology lessons. And truly, the first thing I told them on Monday was about my experience with the whooping cranes. You know, they learn about birds when we unfortunately have window strikes on our building, and you know, where I can show them the colors of, you know, a warbler, or we had a yellow-billed cuckoo window strike. To see those birds in the hand, you know, they really have learned a lot, and then I of course take interest in what is of interest to them as well. So again, sharing the stories and supporting others, and you know, just helping promote those things that are our passions. So certainly a message that resonates with all of us. So all right, well, very good.
Let me make a
Thank you.
comment. Let me make a comment here for a second. This probably generated out of Denver becoming a bird-friendly community than our librarian, but in the last 2 or 3 months, we've encouraged our librarian in our community to put on these Zoom presentations that we've had. The one up in Northeast Iowa is, as we know, fabulous, as is this one. And so we have the opportunity for adults to come in during the day or a program after school that can be put on by the local librarian for a 10-minute or a whatever length of time this session is. And I would encourage all the members that are listening tonight to think about encouraging your librarian in your community to do just that. And in some cases, they may need somebody to come in and sit down and be a monitor while that program is being on. And that would be a great way to volunteer at your library. But without beating this to death, these programs that have been on recently, as you all seem to agree, are certainly great educational opportunities in our communities and a good outreach for Prairie Rapids. That's all.
Oh, thank you.
That's a great idea.
Well,
And it's
with that,
free.
yeah. Well, with that, we'll say good night. And again, thank you, Chris, and for all of you for tuning in. I think we had a good group.
Definitely.
Thanks for all your work this
Thanks
so
year.
much.